I've spent 17 years guiding expeditions through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, and in all that time, I never once questioned what was possible and what wasn't. Mountains were mountains, storms were storms, and the only mysteries worth contemplating were the ones you could solve with experience and preparation. I believed in what I could see, what I could touch, what left evidence in the snow. But there was one expedition that changed everything, one journey that shattered the careful walls I'd built around my understanding of the world. It destroyed more than my certainty. It broke something fundamental between me and my team, fractured bonds forged over years of trust and shared survival. We came down from those peaks as strangers to each other, bound by a silence heavier than any secret we'd ever kept. And now, after all these years of carrying this weight alone, I need to tell someone what we encountered up there in the white silence, in that place where the world still keeps its oldest secrets. Not because I expect you to believe me, but because the truth has been eating at me from the inside, reshaping everything I thought I knew about the natural world and our place within it. We were 5 of us then, seasoned climbers who'd conquered peaks across 3 continents together, who could read each other's movements in a whiteout, who'd pulled each other from crevasses and shared our last rations without hesitation. But something happened in those mountains that stripped away all that brotherhood, replacing it with suspicion and a terror none of us had words for. I remember sitting around our last campfire before we separated for good, watching my oldest friend refuse to meet my eyes, seeing the haunted expression on faces I'd known for a decade. We made a pact that night never to speak of what we'd witnessed. But pacts like that are just fear, dressed up as honor. The silence between us grew until we stopped calling, stopped meeting, stopped pretending we could ever look at each other without remembering. I see one of them. Occasionally in the mountaineering community, at a distance, across crowded rooms, we nod and turn away, because acknowledging each other means acknowledging what we saw, and none of us have been ready to do that, until now, until the weight of not speaking became heavier than the consequences of breaking that promise. The expedition was supposed to be routine, a winter ascent through a region we'd mapped the previous spring, through high passes that most teams avoided during the coldest months. We prided ourselves on going where others wouldn't, on pushing boundaries and laughing at superstition. That arrogance feels like someone else's memory now, like watching a fool walk confidently toward a cliff edge. I remember how certain we were, how dismissive of anything that didn't fit our understanding of mountain hazards and wildlife behavior. We thought we knew everything the peaks could throw at us: altitude sickness, avalanche conditions, frostbite, storms that could erase you from existence. We'd prepared for all of it with the thoroughness of professionals who'd survived, by respecting what we could measure and predict. But you can't prepare for something that shouldn't exist, something that moves through blizzards like a ghost and watches you with eyes that hold more intelligence than comfort allows. You can't train for the moment when your rational mind breaks against something impossible, when everything you've built your identity on crumbles like snow under your boots. I still dream about those mountains, about the silence that fell just before everything changed, about the moment I realized we weren't alone up there and never had been. Sometimes I wake up convinced I can hear it breathing outside my window, that low rumble that vibrated through the tent walls and turned our blood to ice water. My hands are shaking as I tell you this, not from age or cold, but from finally allowing myself to remember in full detail what I've spent years trying to forget. Because what we found in those peaks wasn't just a creature or a legend made flesh. It was proof that the world is deeper and stranger than our maps and science have ever accounted for. And once you've seen past the veil, once you've locked eyes with something ancient and impossible and undeniably real, you can never quite convince yourself that the world you return to is the only one that exists. The village appeared like something from another century, clinging to the mountainside as if it had grown there organically over countless generations. We reached it on the 3rd day of our approach. our convoy of rented vehicles struggling up roads that were barely more than suggestions carved into rock and ice. The settlement consisted of maybe 40 stone structures, with smoke rising from chimneys into the crystal-clear air, prayer flags snapping in the wind like colourful warnings we were too blind to heed. I remember stepping out of the truck and feeling the weight of eyes on us immediately, that prickling awareness that we were being assessed and measured by standards we didn't understand. The villagers emerged slowly from doorways and around corners, their weathered faces revealing nothing, their movements deliberate and watchful. An old woman wrapped in layers of wool and yak hide approached our translator first, speaking in rapid bursts of the local dialect, her gnarled finger pointing repeatedly toward the peaks above. Even before the translation came, I felt the warning in her tone, that universal inflection that transcends language and speaks directly to the primitive part of our brain that still remembers when humans were prey. But we were professionals, confident in our experience, and we smiled with the patronizing kindness of outsiders who think they know better than the people who've lived in the shadow of these mountains for generations. That smile feels like my greatest shame now, that casual dismissal of knowledge carried in bloodlines and whispered through centuries. The elders gathered in the largest building, a structure that served as both community center and temple, its interior thick with incense smoke and the butter lamp glow that made shadows dance across walls, decorated with faded paintings of snow peaks and strange figures. They sat in a semicircle facing us, 7 men and women, whose ages I couldn't begin to guess, their faces maps of wrinkles that spoke of lifetimes spent at altitude, where the air itself tests your right to draw breath. Our translator, Abdu, university student from the capital who'd grown up in a neighboring valley, seemed genuinely uncomfortable as he relayed their words, his voice dropping to near whisper, as if volume might give the warnings more power than he wanted them to have. The White Guardian, they called it, a presence that had walked these mountains since before their grandfathers were born, a protector of the sacred high passes that became something else entirely when outsiders came with greed in their hearts and disrespect in their actions. The head elder, a man whose eyes held a clarity that seemed impossible for someone so ancient, spoke of expeditions that had vanished completely, of mining operations whose workers were found frozen and broken, of climbers who'd returned to the village gibbering and mad with visions they couldn't process. He described the creature in terms that blended the physical with the spiritual, until I couldn't tell where folklore ended and genuine warning began, white as fresh snow, tall as 3 men, with eyes that could see into your intentions and judge whether you deserved to pass or needed to be turned back by whatever means necessary. My team exchanged glances during the translation, those knowing looks between rational people confronted with superstition, barely suppressing smiles that said we understood these were just stories meant to keep outsiders away from whatever resources or sacred sites the locals wanted to protect for themselves. But one detail made me hesitate, made some deeper instinct twitch with unease, even as my conscious mind dismissed it all as folklore amplified by isolation and harsh conditions. The elder pulled out a wooden box from beneath his seat, handling it with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics, and opened it to reveal what he claimed was evidence of the Guardian's existence. Inside, preserved in some kind of resin or amber-like substance, was a tuft of hair unlike anything I'd encountered in my years documenting wildlife sign in mountain regions across the world. Each strand was thick as wire but white as milk, coarse and long, catching the lamplight in a way that seemed almost luminous, almost deliberate. He passed the box around our circle, and when it reached my hands I felt the temperature drop, felt my skin prickle with that ancestral recognition of something fundamentally other. The hair was real, undeniably physical, not Some clever fake designed to fool tourists who never came to this remote place anyway. My teammate Marcus, who had a doctorate in zoology and had studied great apes in 3 countries, examined it with the careful attention of someone whose expertise was being challenged, and I watched his expression shift from amused skepticism to genuine confusion as he turned the strands over in his gloved fingers. The elder watched us with something that might have been pity, that sad recognition of people who were about to learn a terrible lesson they'd carry forever. He said through our translator that the guardian appeared only in the deepest winter, when the passes were meant to be left alone, when the mountains needed their rest and their privacy from human ambition. He said it could smell intention the way we could smell smoke, that it knew the difference between those who came with reverence and those who came to take, to conquer, to prove something at the expense of the sacred. He said we should wait, should postpone our expedition until spring, should respect the customs that had kept his people alive in this impossible place for longer than our civilizations had kept written records. We thanked them for their concern with words that barely masked our condescension, accepting the dried meat and blessed scarves they offered with the gracious tolerance of people honoring quaint traditions we didn't believe in. As we left the village the next morning before dawn, loaded with supplies and confidence, I glanced back once to see the elders standing in a line watching our departure, their faces grave as mourners at a funeral. The old man who'd shown us the hare raised one hand in what I thought was farewell. But now I understand it was something else entirely, an acknowledgement perhaps, or a prayer for fools who wouldn't listen. Or maybe just a gesture of respect for people he knew would soon understand what his words could never adequately convey. The prayer flags snapped above them in the pre-dawn wind, and for just a moment I felt the full weight of what we were dismissing, the accumulated wisdom of people who'd negotiated their existence with something we were about to meet on terms we couldn't begin to comprehend. Then Marcus made a joke about cryptozoology and tourism revenue. We all laughed, and the moment passed as we turned our backs on the last warning we'd receive and headed up into the mountains, where the White Guardian kept its ancient watch. That laugh echoes in my memory now, like the sound of a door closing on everything I used to be, the last expression of an innocence I would never recover. The final moment before the world revealed itself to be vastly stranger and more terrible and more wonderful than I'd ever imagined possible. The ascent began in conditions that seemed almost mockingly perfect. Clear skies, manageable winds, the kind of weather that makes mountaineers feel invincible and forgetful of how quickly the Himalayas can transform from cathedral to crematorium. We established our base camp at just over 16,000 feet in a sheltered valley between 2 ridges, where the wind carved sculptures from the snow, and the silence felt profound enough to have weight and texture. That first night passed without incident, our tents glowing like small orange beacons against the vast darkness. Our conversations full of route planning and summit strategies, the easy confidence of professionals doing what we'd trained our entire lives to do. But I woke just before dawn to a sound that shouldn't have existed in that landscape, a howl that resonated through the mountains with a timbre I'd never encountered, despite years spent in wild places where wolves and big cats announced their presence to the night. It wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. Something in between that made my throat tighten and my hands go cold inside my sleeping bag, a sound that seemed designed specifically to trigger every evolutionary warning system we've developed over millennia of being occasionally prey instead of predator. The others heard it too, I could tell by the sudden tension in the camp, the way breathing patterns changed in the neighboring tents, the quality of silence that follows when everyone is awake but nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge their fear. When we finally emerged into the grey pre-dawn light, Marcus tried to rationalize it as wind through rock formations, or perhaps a snow leopard, though his voice carried none of his usual professorial certainty, and nobody mentioned that snow leopards don't howl like that. don't make sounds that seem to contain something almost like language, almost like warning, almost like sorrow wrapped in a threat. The footprints appeared on the second morning, circling our camp in a wide perimeter that suggested surveillance rather than random animal movement. Each print pressed deep into snow that had been undisturbed when we'd gone to sleep. I've tracked bears in Alaska, documented gorilla sign in Rwanda, followed tiger pug marks through Indian forests, but these prints belong to something that rewrote my understanding of what was possible in the catalogue of living creatures. They were humanoid, but massive, easily 18 inches long and 7 across, showing 5 distinct toes with what appeared to be dermal ridges visible in the clearest impressions. The depth indicating a weight far beyond any known primate, the stride length suggesting something that moved with powerful efficiency through terrain that challenged our every step. Sarah, our team's wildlife biologist, photographed them from every angle, with hands that trembled despite her attempts at scientific detachment, taking measurements while maintaining a silence that felt like reverence or dread or both. The prints led away toward the higher peaks and then simply stopped at an exposed rock face, as if whatever made them had either climbed a vertical cliff or simply ceased to exist at that exact point, defying the logical progression that tracks should tell a complete story of arrival and departure. We followed the trail as far as we could, compelled by curiosity and professional obligation, but the quality of light changed as we tracked deeper into a narrow valley, the shadows taking on weight and presence, the silence becoming something that pressed against our eardrums until even our breathing seemed intrusive and unwelcome. Nobody suggested we were being watched, but we all felt it, that crawling sensation between the shoulder blades that comes from being observed by something that doesn't want to be seen, that chooses the moment of revelation according to its own purposes and timeline that we couldn't begin to predict or control. The storms rolled in on the third day with a violence that seemed personal, targeted, as if the mountain itself had decided we'd gone far enough and needed to be tested or turned back. We huddled in our tents while wind speeds reached levels that made the fabric crack like gunshots, the snow falling so thick and fast that visibility dropped to arm's length, the world contracting to just the small space we could defend with our body heat and our increasingly fragile equipment. But through the howling wind came those other howls, closer now, multiple voices that seemed to answer each other from different positions around our camp, a coordinated pattern that suggested intelligence and intention that made my skin prickle despite the layers of technical fabric designed to keep me warm and dry. Marcus tried to convince us they were hallucinations, brought on by altitude and stress, that our oxygen-deprived brains were creating patterns from random noise, but his eyes kept darting to the tent walls as if expecting them to split open and reveal whatever circled outside in the whiteout conditions. Each morning we'd emerge to find new prints, different sizes now suggesting more than one creature, their paths crisscrossing through our camp in patterns that felt deliberate, almost like a language written in the snow that we lacked the grammar to decode. They never touched our equipment, never disturbed our supplies, but items would be moved slightly. A fuel canister rotated 45 degrees, an ice axe repositioned 6 inches from where it had been planted, small alterations that proved we were being visited by something with hands capable of manipulation and a mind capable of sending messages we were too frightened or too stubborn to properly receive. On that fourth night, the night everything changed, the storm reached a crescendo that made our previous challenges seem like gentle preparation for the main event. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked, it screamed, it tried to physically tear our shelter from the mountain and send us tumbling into the void below, and we lay in our sleeping bags, gripping the tent poles like shipwreck survivors, clinging to debris in a savage sea. Then through the chaos came the breathing, the sound of something massive drawing air in and out of lungs that must have been the size of oil drums, the steady rhythm of respiration so close to my tent wall that I could feel the warmth of exhalation penetrating the fabric, could smell something wild and musky and ancient that made every hair on my body stand at attention. It circled slowly, deliberately, taking perhaps 5 minutes to complete the circuit around our 3 tents, and in that time, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even shifted position for fear of drawing attention from whatever had come to examine us in the darkness and the storm. I heard Jennifer whimper in the tent she shared with Sarah, heard Marcus praying in whispered Spanish in the tent beside mine, heard my own heartbeat so loud in my ears that I thought surely the creature must hear it too, must know exactly where each of us lay in our fragile orange shells, waiting to learn if we would see another dawn. Then came a sound I'll carry to my grave, a low rumbling vocalization that wasn't quite speech, but carried unmistakable meaning, a sound that resonated in my chest cavity and seemed to ask a question I couldn't articulate, but somehow understood on a level deeper than language, deeper than conscious thought, in that ancient part of the brain that still remembers when we shared the world with other intelligent species and had to negotiate our place rather than assume our dominance. The breathing moved away, the footsteps crunching through the snow fading gradually into the storm, and we lay there until morning light finally came, none of us willing to acknowledge aloud what had just evaluated us and apparently decided to let us live, at least for one more night, at least until we did whatever it was waiting for us to do, whatever test we hadn't yet passed or failed. When dawn finally broke, we discovered Jennifer was gone. Not missing in the chaotic way of someone who wandered from camp disoriented. Her sleeping bag was neatly arranged, her boots gone, but her pack remaining, and the tent zipper carefully closed from the outside as if she'd left for a simple morning necessity and planned to return within minutes. But the drag marks told a different story. 2 parallel depressions in the fresh snow leading upward toward the ridge. Not the frantic scraping of violent abduction, but the smooth tracks of something carrying a burden with surprising gentleness, almost cradling. We followed immediately despite our terror. Marcus and Sarah and I roped together, our headlamps cutting weak beams through the pre-dawn darkness, calling Jennifer's name into a silence that swallowed our voices without echo or response. The tracks led us higher than we'd planned to go that day, into technical terrain that required focus and skill, but whoever made them had traversed this ground without hesitation, without the careful placement we needed, moving with the confidence of something that knew every rock and ice formation intimately, had perhaps walked these paths for longer than our minds could comfortably conceive. I realized with growing unease that we weren't tracking something that had taken our companion. We were being led, guided along a specific route that avoided the most dangerous sections, that seemed designed to bring us to a particular destination at a particular time, for purposes we couldn't yet understand, but could feel pressing against the edges of our awareness, like a message written in a language we'd forgotten we once knew. We found her 2 hours into the climb in an ice cave so perfectly formed it seemed architectural rather than geological, her body arranged with care on a bed of pine branches that shouldn't have existed at this altitude, covered with more boughs that created insulation against the cold, that would have killed her during the night. She was breathing, her vital signs stable when Sarah checked them with trembling hands, but her eyes were open and unseeing, locked on some vision or memory that held her consciousness in a grip we couldn't break with our voices or our touch. The cave itself stopped us cold, the walls smooth as if polished, the floor level and clear of debris, and arranged in a careful circle around Jennifer were stones of various sizes, each one placed with obvious intention, creating a pattern that felt ceremonial, protective, almost sacred. I'd seen similar arrangements at ancient sites, the kind of symbolic language that predates writing, that speaks through placement and geometry about concepts too important for mere words. This wasn't the lair of a mindless beast defending territory. This was a space prepared by intelligence, by something that understood shelter and care, that had chosen not to harm but to preserve, that had taken Jennifer for reasons we couldn't fathom, but had kept her alive, with a gentleness that contradicted everything our rational minds insisted about dangerous wild creatures. Marcus photographed everything with shaking hands, while Sarah tried every medical technique she knew to rouse Jennifer from her catatonic state. But I found myself studying the stone pattern, trying to read meaning in the arrangement, sensing that this was communication, that we were being told something crucial. If we could only develop the grammar to understand the message being offered across the vast gulf that separated our species and our ways of knowing the world. We were preparing to carry Jennifer down to base camp when the whiteout hit, visibility dropping to nothing in seconds, the world becoming an undifferentiated grey where sky and ground merged into uniform disorientation. Then it appeared in the cave entrance, filling the space completely, and my mind struggled to process what my eyes reported, because the categories I'd relied on to organize reality suddenly proved inadequate to contain this being. 8 feet tall at minimum, covered in thick white fur that seemed to absorb and reflect the diffuse light simultaneously, with shoulders broad enough to suggest immense strength, but a posture that conveyed something other than aggression, something closer to assessment or even concern. But it was the eyes that unmade me, that rewrote everything I'd believed about consciousness and intelligence, and the hierarchy we'd constructed to place ourselves at the summit of creation. They were dark and deep, and carried such weight of experience that I felt suddenly young, suddenly foolish, suddenly aware that we were the newcomers here, the interlopers in a story that had been unfolding for millennia, before our species even conceived of mountains as things to be conquered rather than revered. It looked at each of us in turn, and I felt that gaze penetrate not just my body, but my intention, my character, the essential nature of what I carried inside, beyond the equipment and the ambition and the fragile certainty that had brought me to this moment. Then it did something that shattered my remaining composure. It reached out one massive hand, and with impossible gentleness touched Jennifer's forehead. Just a brief contact, before turning and walking back into the storm without threat or violence, simply offering its presence and then withdrawing, leaving us gasping in the aftermath of an encounter that felt less like wildlife observation and more like an audience with something we had no framework to properly comprehend or categorize. We sat in that cave for perhaps an hour after it left, none of us capable of speech. None of us ready to face what returning to camp would mean, what discussions we'd need to have about what we'd witnessed and what it implied. Sarah held Jennifer's hand and wept quietly, though whether from fear or relief or something more profound I couldn't determine. Marcus stared at the stone circle as if it might suddenly resolve into clear meaning, his scientific training warring with evidence that demanded new categories, new possibilities he'd spent his career dismissing as fantasy or fraud or misidentification. I found myself thinking about the touch, the deliberate gentleness of that massive hand against Jennifer's forehead, the care implicit in that gesture, and realized we'd been granted something rare and terrible, proof that we share this world with intelligence we've chosen not to acknowledge, that walks in places we claim to have mapped completely, that watches us with eyes that have seen our entire history unfold, and judges us not by our technology or our achievements, but by something more fundamental, something we've perhaps forgotten in our rush to dominate and categorize and claim dominion over every living system. When we finally gathered the courage to leave, to carry Jennifer down through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in the whiteout, we found the path marked with broken branches, small cairns of stone, unmistakable signs that something was guiding us home, ensuring we survived despite our inadequacy, despite our intrusion, showing mercy we perhaps didn't deserve, but that was being offered anyway, by something that understood these mountains and our fragility within them far better than we ever would, regardless of our maps and our equipment and our proud certainty that we'd conquered the last wild places and reduced them to recreational challenges rather than sacred spaces. We entered only with permission from powers far older than our civilizations and far wiser than our sciences. We made it back to base camp as night fell, Jennifer's body a dead weight between us, despite our attempts to rouse her from whatever mental space she occupied, her eyes still tracking visions we couldn't see, her lips occasionally moving, in silent conversation with presences we couldn't perceive. The storm had cleared by the time we settled her into the medical tent, and Sarah worked through the night, checking vitals that remained stubbornly normal, even as Jennifer's consciousness stayed locked away behind walls we couldn't breach or comprehend. I sat with her during the darkest hours, watching her face for signs of return, and found myself wondering what she'd experienced in that ice cave before we arrived, what had transpired between her and the creature during those lost hours when she lay alone in the dark, with something our entire culture had dismissed as myth or delusion, or the misidentified shadows of more mundane animals. The altitude made sleep impossible anyway, but it wasn't oxygen deprivation that kept me wakeful. It was the growing certainty that Jennifer had been chosen for something, selected for reasons that had everything to do with who she was beneath the expedition gear and the professional credentials, and that when she finally returned to us, she would carry knowledge that would change everything we thought we understood about consciousness and communication, and the borders we'd drawn between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, between the rational world we'd constructed and the older, deeper reality that existed before our categories and would persist long after our certainties crumbled into the same dust that claimed every empire that ever believed itself permanent. She spoke just before dawn, her voice rough from disuse but clear, her eyes finally focusing on my face with recognition that brought tears of relief I hadn't known I was holding back. But her first words weren't about rescue or gratitude or the practical concerns of survival. Instead, she asked me if I understood what the stones meant, if I'd been able to read the message in their arrangement. And when I admitted my failure, she smiled with such sadness that my heart broke for reasons I couldn't articulate. Then she told us what had happened in that cave, her words coming slowly, as if she was translating from a language that had no direct equivalent in our vocabulary, that required metaphor and approximation because the experience existed beyond the boundaries of normal perception. The creature hadn't harmed her when it approached the tent. It had simply stood outside, breathing into the fabric, and she'd felt compelled to emerge, drawn by something that bypassed fear and spoke directly to a deeper part of her consciousness that recognized the summons as important, as necessary, as the answer to questions she'd been asking her entire life without knowing she was seeking. It had carried her with impossible tenderness, one arm supporting her weight as if she were precious, cargo that might break if handled roughly, and she'd felt no terror during the journey upward, only a strange peace that settled over her like the pine branches it would later use to keep her warm. In the cave, it had touched her forehead with one massive finger, and in that moment of contact she'd experienced not words or images, but something more fundamental, a direct transmission of memory and emotion and understanding that poured through her consciousness like water through parched earth, filling spaces she hadn't known were empty, with knowledge our species had forgotten or never possessed. What she described made Marcus shake his head in denial, made Sarah reach for medical explanations about altitude and stress and traumatic responses to extreme fear, but I listened without interruption because I'd seen those eyes and knew that something profound had occurred in that cave beyond the reach of our comfortable materialism. Jennifer spoke of memories that stretched back millennia, of these mountains when they were young and still rising, of watching human tribes migrate through valleys that no longer existed, of witnessing empires rise and collapse with the brief intensity of summer storms. The creature's kind had been here before we invented writing or agriculture, or the concept of ownership that led us to draw lines across living landscapes and claim dominion over systems we barely comprehended. They had watched us grow clever and dangerous, had seen what we did to forests and rivers and each other, had witnessed the casual violence we called progress and the systematic destruction we renamed development. But they had also seen beauty in us, moments of grace and compassion that suggested we might still remember our proper place in the intricate web of life that sustained all beings. The touch had conveyed all of this without language, a direct sharing of experience that bypassed words entirely, and Jennifer wept as she described it, because she'd felt the creature's loneliness, the devastating isolation of being perhaps the last of its kind, of carrying millennia of memory with no one left to share the burden, of watching humanity spread across every landscape while its own species dwindled into legend and then less than legend, into joke and costume and blurry photograph that proved nothing except our capacity for the whiteout hit us on the descent, a wall of white that erased the world. In seconds, and we huddled together with ropes connecting us like umbilical cords, because 3 meters of visibility meant that separation equaled death in these conditions. Jennifer had gone quiet again after her revelations, conserving energy for the journey down, but I saw her scanning the swirling snow as if expecting something, as if waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. The wind screamed around us with voices that almost sounded like words, and Marcus kept checking his compass even though we all knew the readings were useless in this magnetic chaos, this atmospheric fury that reduced our technology to expensive paperweights. Then Sarah grabbed my arm and pointed upward, her gloved hand shaking not from cold, but from the primal recognition of something that shouldn't exist, something that violated every natural law we'd internalized since childhood. The creature stood on an outcropping above us, nearly invisible against the snow except for the darkness of its eyes and the impossible size that no trick of perspective could explain away. It was watching us with an intensity that felt like physical pressure against my chest, and I understood in that moment why ancient peoples had built religions around encounters with the numinous, why they'd needed rituals and offerings and elaborate mythologies to process experiences that shattered normal categories of understanding. This was no animal, despite the fur and the physical form. This was something else entirely, something that carried awareness and intentionality in its gaze, something that saw us not as potential threats or prey, but as individuals whose choices and character mattered in ways that transcended the usual calculus of survival. It began, moving then, not toward us but parallel to our intended route, and the way it navigated terrain that killed experienced climbers without effort demonstrated a mastery of this environment so complete it seemed like partnership rather than conquest, like the mountain itself was cooperating with its oldest resident. Jennifer started following without hesitation, tugging on the rope that connected us until Marcus swore and stumbled after her, and I found myself choosing trust over training, intuition over the protocols we'd established back when the world made sense and contained nothing that couldn't be catalogued or explained. The creature led us in a wide arc around what looked like solid ground, and when Marcus demanded we stop this insanity, I grabbed a rock and tossed it onto the snow ahead where our original path would have taken us. The stone disappeared instantly, swallowed by a crevasse field hidden beneath fresh powder, and the silence that followed was broken only by wind and the terrible understanding of how close we'd come to vanishing like so many expedition teams whose disappearances got attributed to human error or bad luck rather than the simpler truth that mountains kill and we are fragile. The White Guardian, because that's what it was, regardless of what science called it or refused to call it, had saved us from ourselves, from our assumptions and our inadequate maps and our fundamental ignorance of landscapes we treated as conquerable when they were actually just temporarily tolerant of our presence. It stood at a safe distance after redirecting our path, not approaching, but not fleeing either. And I felt certain it could have vanished into the storm whenever it chose, but was choosing instead to remain visible, to let us see it fully, to make its existence undeniable so we couldn't later dismiss the encounter as hallucination or misidentification. The face was what destroyed my capacity for skepticism, the features that combined animal and something beyond animal into an expression that conveyed emotions I recognized, despite the alien. Architecture of the skull and the proportions that belonged in mythology, not on a mountainside in the 21st century. There was sorrow in those eyes, ancient and deep as the valleys carved by glaciers that had ground rock to powder over eons. And I felt tears freeze on my cheeks because I was seeing something that carried the weight of witnessing too much, of surviving too long, of being the last remnant of a world that humans had systematically erased. But there was also something else in that gaze, evaluation perhaps, or judgment, as if the creature was measuring us against some internal standard and finding us just barely acceptable, just worthy enough of salvation, despite our species' track record of destruction and displacement. I wanted to speak, but had no words adequate to the moment, nothing in my vocabulary that could bridge the gulf between us. So instead, I simply raised one hand in acknowledgement, in gratitude, in recognition that we stood before something that commanded respect, not through threat, but through sheer presence. The creature's head tilted slightly, as if considering my gesture, and then it did something that will haunt me until my last breath. It raised its own hand in mirror of mine, a deliberate imitation that demonstrated not just intelligence, but the capacity for symbolic communication, for understanding that gestures carried meaning. Beyond instinct, that connection was possible even across the vast, evolutionary distance that separated our kinds. Then it turned and walked into the whiteout, its massive form dissolving into snow until only the memory remained. And we stood there in the screaming wind, knowing we'd been given something that perhaps we didn't deserve. A second chance. A gift from something that had every reason to let us wander into oblivion, but chose mercy instead. Jennifer was smiling through her exhaustion, vindicated in ways that required no explanation, and even Marcus looked shaken from his empiricism, his worldview cracked by what couldn't be rationalized or dismissed. We made it down without speaking much, each of us locked in private recalibration of what was possible, what was real, what obligations we now carried as witnesses to something that demanded testimony, even knowing no one would believe us without experiencing it themselves. The base camp felt like a graveyard when we reached it 2 days later, our equipment scattered by wines, but otherwise untouched by scavengers or opportunistic predators that should have torn through our supplies in our absence. Sarah immediately began documenting everything with her camera, compulsively filming the footprints that circled our tents in patterns too deliberate to be random wandering, and I realized she was gathering evidence not to convince others, but to convince herself, to create external validation for experiences that felt increasingly like fever dreams now that we'd descended into thinner air and clearer weather. Marcus went through our gear with mechanical precision, checking inventory as if accounting for freeze-dried meals and fuel canisters could restore order to a universe that had revealed itself as far stranger than we'd believed, and I recognized the behavior as trauma response, as the human need to control small things when larger things have spiraled beyond comprehension. Jennifer sat apart from us, staring back up at the peaks we'd descended, and when I joined her, she spoke without looking at me, her voice carrying certainty that was either enlightenment or the first stage of a breakdown I wasn't qualified to diagnose. She said the creature had shown her more than just memories of its kind stewardship, that through whatever communion they'd shared, she'd glimpsed the accumulated grief of watching entire ecosystems collapse, of witnessing species extinctions and glacial retreats, and the slow poisoning of altitudes that used to represent refuge from human impact. The weight of that knowledge sat in her words like stones, and I understood that she'd been given a burden as much as a revelation, that bearing witness to that scale of loss was a form of suffering we'd imposed on, something that had never asked to be the final guardian of places we were methodically destroying. We should have left immediately, descended to the village and then to civilization, where hot showers and internet connections could have numbed the edges of what we'd experienced. But something kept us there an additional night, some unspoken consensus that we weren't finished, that the encounter had been interrupted rather than concluded. The mining operation Sarah had noticed on our maps seemed suddenly significant, an abandoned corporate venture from decades ago that had lasted only a single season before shutting down under circumstances the official records left deliberately vague. And when Marcus suggested we investigate, I saw in his eyes the same need I felt, the need for context, for explanation, for some framework that could contain what we'd witnessed and give it meaning beyond the purely mystical. We found the site 2 hours hike from camp, half buried in snow and ice, but still recognizable as human. Construction, prefab buildings collapsed under avalanche weight, and equipment rusted into abstract sculptures by altitude and weather. The bodies were in the largest structure, preserved by cold into grotesque statues of their final moments. And even through decades of freezing, they told a clear story of violence, of systematic destruction that had nothing to do with accidents or natural disasters, and everything to do with intentional force, applied by something powerful enough to tear through walls and crush metal with ease that spoke of barely restrained rage. Sarah counted 11 corpses, all showing similar trauma patterns. Massive blunt force injuries, consistent with being struck by something wielding strength far beyond human capacity. Defensive wounds, suggesting they'd tried to fight back or flee, but been overwhelmed by an attacker that moved faster and hit harder than should have been physically possible. The implications settled over us like ash, reconstructing the narrative we'd been living into something more complex and morally ambiguous than the simple salvation story we'd been telling ourselves. The White Guardian hadn't just protected us from natural hazards. It had chosen not to kill us the way it had clearly killed these miners, had extended mercy to our expedition, while denying it to others who'd come to these mountains with different intentions and different tools of exploitation. Jennifer found the drilling equipment still in place, industrial apparatus designed to extract core samples from the mountain itself, and beside it were documents in waterproof cases that detailed plans for massive mineral extraction, for corporate operations that would have gutted entire peaks for rare earth elements and precious metals, regardless of environmental cost or spiritual significance. These men hadn't come as visitors, or even as conquerors. They'd come as harvesters, as strip miners of the sacred, and they'd been stopped with extreme prejudice by something that had apparently decided their presence crossed a line that triggered not warning, but elimination. I felt my understanding of the creature shift from mystical protector to something more complicated, more dangerous, a conscious agent making life and death decisions based on criteria we'd only partially satisfied, an intelligence that extended mercy selectively and withdrew it permanently when its judgments went against you. We'd been tested without knowing it, evaluated on some scale that measured intentions and impacts rather than just actions. and the fact that we'd passed felt less like blessing and more like narrow escape from consequences that had been moments away from implementation. The fear that crystallized in that frozen morgue was different from the primal terror of the unknown. This was the sophisticated dread of realizing we'd been under surveillance by something capable of coordinated violence, that every moment of our expedition had potentially been our last if we'd made different choices or demonstrated different values to whatever had been watching from the heights. Marcus was shaking as he photographed the scene, his scientific detachment finally shattered by the recognition that we existed in a world where intelligence didn't guarantee communication or safety, where beings with their own ancient ethics might judge us by standards we couldn't fully comprehend and execute those judgments with lethal finality if we failed to meet them. Sarah kept repeating that we had to report this, that authorities needed to know what had happened here, but even as she spoke, we all understood the futility. Who would believe that an undocumented species had committed justifiable homicide in defense of mountain sanctity? Who would prosecute crimes against miners who died decades ago at the hands of something that existed in the gaps of official knowledge? Jennifer was the only one who seemed unsurprised by the discovery, as if the visions she'd received had already included this chapter of the story, this evidence that protection and destruction were two expressions of the same fierce commitment to preservation that allowed no compromise with forces that threatened complete desecration. She looked at me with eyes that had seen through the creature's perspective and said, "We should be grateful that we'd approached these heights with enough humility and respect to register as something other than invaders, that our survival was the creature's way of saying that not all humans had to die for the sins of our species, but that the option remained permanently on the table." We made camp in one of the intact structures that night, none of us willing to spend another darkness in the tents where we'd been circled and evaluated. And as the temperature dropped, Jennifer finally began to speak in detail about what had passed between her and the creature during those hours in the ice cave. Her voice carried a strange quality, like someone translating a language that existed beyond words into approximations that couldn't fully capture the original meaning, and she described the communion not as conversation, but as direct transmission of experience, as if decades or centuries of accumulated memory had been compressed and transferred through contact that bypassed normal human sensory processing entirely. She said the creature hadn't just shown her images, but had made her feel the emotional weight behind them, the specific quality of grief that comes from watching beloved places transform and diminish, from knowing with absolute certainty that you're witnessing something precious dying in increments too slow for most observers to register as catastrophe. The mountains had been different when the creature was young, she told us. The glaciers deeper and more stable, the wildlife more abundant, the very air itself cleaner in ways that affected everything from plant growth to the clarity of starlight at altitude, and it had watched all of that deteriorate across a lifespan that stretched beyond human comprehension of time. What broke me wasn't the scale of the loss Jennifer described, but the loneliness embedded in it, the recognition that this being had spent generations as witness and guardian to a slow-motion apocalypse that most of humanity remained oblivious to or indifferent about, that its entire existence had become a solitary vigil over diminishing sanctuaries that grew smaller with each passing decade. She described how it had shown her the last time it had encountered others of its kind, a meeting that had occurred when she was a child in a world that still had functioning video rental stores and believed the internet would save democracy, and even that rare communion had been marked by shared sorrow rather than joy, by the tacit acknowledgement that their species was approaching some terminal threshold beyond which continued existence became merely theoretical. The creature lived with the knowledge that it might be the last of its kind in these particular mountains, that its death would transform these peaks from protected sacred space into just another resource extraction opportunity for whoever came next with sufficient capital and insufficient conscience. Jennifer wept as she shared this, tears freezing on her cheeks in the inadequate shelter we'd claimed, and I understood she was crying for the creature, but also for herself, for the burden of carrying knowledge that made normal human concerns feel trivial, while simultaneously making the daily work of living feel impossibly heavy. Marcus asked the question we were all thinking: why? Why had the creature chosen to share this particular revelation with our expedition, when it could have simply driven us away or eliminated us like it had the miners? What made our presence different enough to warrant education instead of punishment or prevention? Jennifer's answer came slowly, as if she was still processing the understanding herself, and she said the creature had sensed something in our approach that registered as grief adjacent, that our way of moving through the mountains carried echoes of the same awareness it possessed, the recognition that we were climbing through a world that was already halfway to extinction, whether most people acknowledged it or not. We'd come here not as conquerors or extractors, but as witnesses, as people seeking something in the heights that civilization couldn't provide, and that seeking had apparently been visible to something that had learned to identify human intentions through centuries of careful observation and bitter experience. The creature had tested us not just by circling our camp, but by taking Jennifer, by creating a scenario where our response would reveal our fundamental nature, whether we'd abandon her, whether we'd approach with weapons and aggression, whether we'd demonstrate the capacity for patience and respect that might indicate we belong to the minority of humans who could be trusted with knowledge of its existence. The real revelation came near dawn, when Jennifer finally described what the creature had asked of her, the request it had transmitted not through words, but through emotional impression that carried the weight of desperate hope, fighting against experiential certainty that hope was foolish. It wanted witnesses, she told us, her voice barely above a whisper in the structure's darkness. It wanted humans who had seen and understood to carry that knowledge back into the world where choices were still being made about how aggressively to exploit what remained of the wild places, whether to treat mountains as sacred or as obstacles to quarterly profit margins and shareholder value. The creature harbored no illusions that our testimony would change the trajectory of human civilization, but it had shown Jennifer that even terminal situations contained gradients, that the difference between total destruction and partial preservation might come down to whether enough people knew that something precious was being lost, whether any one human mourned the diminishment loudly enough to slow, if not stop, the mechanisms of exploitation. We'd been recruited, I realized, conscripted into service as evangelists for a cause that would mark us as eccentric at best and delusional at worst, charged with bearing witness to something most people would dismiss as fantasy while watching the very landscapes we'd sworn to protect continue their long slide toward industrial desecration and climate collapse. We found the mining operation on the 6th day, though Jennifer insisted she'd known its location since the cave, that the creature had placed the knowledge in her mind, like coordinates written in a language older than cartography, and as we approached the site, the wrongness of it became apparent even from a distance. Unnatural geometric shapes jutting from the snowfield, the discoloration of exposed rock where nothing should have been disturbed, the absence of the subtle environmental sounds that had accompanied us throughout the expedition. The camp itself was a frozen tableau of interrupted activity, tents collapsed under ice weight, equipment scattered in patterns that suggested sudden chaos rather than orderly abandonment. And everywhere we looked, there were bodies, 17 in total, preserved by the cold in postures that told stories of terror and violence that needed no verbal elaboration. These weren't deaths from exposure or altitude sickness, weren't the peaceful fade-out of hypothermia that mountaineers sometimes experience as a drowsy surrender to overwhelming cold. These were men who had died fighting something that had systematically dismantled their presence with calculated fury. Marcus documented everything with his camera, his hands shaking not from cold, but from the recognition that we were recording evidence of justified rage, that what we'd initially interpreted as monster behavior revealed itself as proportional response to invasion. And I felt my entire framework for understanding the encounter shift as I stood among the frozen dead who had come here not as witnesses, but as conquistadors. The mining equipment told the story more completely than the bodies ever could. Industrial drills designed for deep core sampling, explosive charges catalogued and prepared for systematic detonation, geological surveys that mapped the mountain's interior with the cold precision of surgeons planning where to make. Cuts for maximum extraction efficiency with minimal concern for what would be destroyed in the process. They'd been here to hollow out the sacred mountain, to transform ancient stone into commodities with ticker symbols and fluctuating market values, to reduce millennia of geological formation into quarterly earnings reports that would be celebrated by shareholders who would never see these peaks or breathe this air or understand what was being converted from priceless to merely expensive. The creature hadn't attacked them for being human. I understood with sudden clarity that felt like revelation and indictment simultaneously. It had stopped them for attempting to murder the mountain itself, for bringing the machinery of civilizational appetite into one of the last places where that hunger hadn't yet achieved total consumption. What we'd interpreted as legendary monster behavior was actually defensive action, the equivalent of an immune system responding to infection and standing there among the evidence of interrupted exploitation. I felt something shift in my understanding of what constituted violence and what constituted protection, who were the real intruders in this scenario, and what actually deserved to be called sacred. Jennifer stood apart from us near the largest drilling rig, her hand resting on the frozen metal in a gesture that looked like mourning or perhaps benediction, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the trauma that had marked her earlier testimony, but instead a strange serenity that was somehow more unsettling than her previous distress. She said the creature had shown her this place specifically, had included the memory of this confrontation in the transmission, not to justify its actions, but to demonstrate the mathematics of loss, to make her understand that these 17 deaths represented a conscious choice between smaller and larger catastrophes, between allowing these particular humans to live and allowing the mountain itself to survive in anything resembling its current form. The creature felt each killing, she told us, experienced something like grief, even while committing acts that human law would classify as murder, because its existence had been shaped by centuries of choosing between impossible options, of measuring individual lives against collective survival, of bearing the emotional weight of violence committed in service of protection. It didn't want to be a killer, Jennifer said with absolute certainty. It wanted to be obsolete, wanted to live in a world where humans had evolved sufficiently that guardians like itself were unnecessary, but that world remained theoretical, while this one demanded constant vigilance against the next wave of exploitation. Dressed in the language of progress and economic necessity, walking back through the high passes toward civilization, I carried the knowledge of those frozen miners like stones in my pack, feeling the weight of understanding that complicated every simple narrative I'd ever constructed about good and evil, about humanity's place in the natural world, about what we owed to the voiceless and ancient things that had no representation in our systems of law and commerce. The creature had shown us its truth not to recruit us as advocates, I realized, but to ensure that when we told our story, and we would tell it, that much was certain, we would tell it completely, including the parts that made us uncomfortable, that forced us to reckon with the reality that protection sometimes required force, that some boundaries needed to be enforced with consequences severe enough to make violation genuinely costly. We'd been transformed from mountaineers into witnesses, from seekers into missionaries for a cause that would consume the rest of our lives with its implications. And as we descended into thicker air, I understood that the real expedition was just beginning, that everything before this had merely been preparation for the harder work of living with knowledge that changed how I saw every development project, every resource extraction debate, every casual conversation about humanity's right to reshape the world according to our temporary preferences and permanent appetites. The expedition report we filed was meticulous in its documentation of everything except the truth that mattered, detailing weather conditions and route difficulties and the tragic loss of research equipment in an avalanche that had never actually occurred, while the photographs Marcus had taken of the mining camp remained locked in a safe deposit box alongside Jennifer's written testimony and my own journals that recorded what we'd actually witnessed in those high passes. We'd made the calculation during our descent that the world wasn't ready for the complete story, that releasing evidence of the creature would bring exactly the kind of attention these mountains couldn't survive, that protecting the White Guardian meant participating in the conspiracy of silence that had kept it safe for generations, despite the personal cost of carrying unexplainable knowledge. The team dissolved within months, not from broken bonds, but from the centrifugal force of possessing information too large to contain within ordinary lives. Marcus moving to legal advocacy for indigenous land rights, Jennifer disappearing into academic research on sacred geography, while I continued guiding expeditions through safer ranges where the only mysteries were meteorological and the only guardians were hired by climbing companies to manage liability concerns. But the mountains had marked me in ways that couldn't be documented on any expedition report, had installed a restlessness that made civilization feel like an elaborate costume I wore, without ever forgetting it was just performance, and every night I dreamed of white fur against white, snow and eyes that carried the weight of watching humanity repeat its mistakes across centuries of escalating scale and accelerating consequence. 3 years passed before I returned, traveling alone this time without permits or sponsors or any official record that I'd left the city where I'd constructed a life that looked successful to anyone who measured such things by conventional metrics of career advancement and financial stability. The village elders recognized me immediately despite my attempts at anonymity, their knowing looks confirming what I'd suspected, that our expedition had become part of the local oral history, another chapter in the ongoing story of outsiders who encountered the White Guardian and returned changed in ways that couldn't be concealed regardless of what official reports claimed. They didn't question my purpose when I purchased supplies for a solo trek, didn't offer warnings or demand explanations, simply provided what I needed with the dignified economy of people who understood that some journeys answer to obligations beyond recreational mountaineering or scientific inquiry. I carried with me an offering that had taken months to acquire properly, a collection of items that represented apology and respect and commitment. Traditional objects whose significance I'd researched with the same obsessive thoroughness I'd once applied to route planning and equipment selection, knowing that symbolic language was the only dialect appropriate for the conversation I hoped to have. The ascent felt different this time, not easier despite my familiarity with the terrain, but imbued with ceremonial weight, each step a deliberate choice rather than athletic achievement, and I understood, with clarity that had taken years to develop, that I wasn't climbing towards something, but rather answering a summons that had been quietly insistent since our descent, a gravitational pull that had nothing to do with adventure and everything to do with completion. I built the offering cairn at the location where we'd first seen the creature, clearly arranging the objects according to patterns Jennifer had described from her vision. And then I waited as the sun declined and shadows lengthened across the snowfields with the patient geometry of cosmic movement, indifferent to human urgency. The temperature dropped steadily, but I felt no impulse to retreat to the tent I'd erected as nominal shelter, understanding somehow that this vigil required exposure, that whatever communion I sought couldn't happen from behind nylon walls designed to maintain the artificial boundary between human comfort and environmental reality. Hours passed in silence, broken only by wind articulation and the occasional crack of settling ice, and I cycled through doubt about the entire enterprise, questioning whether I was engaged in meaningful ritual or just indulging psychological needs dressed in spiritual costume, whether the creature had been real or collective altitude hallucination rationalized into shared mythology. But as darkness achieved totality and cold became genuinely dangerous rather than merely uncomfortable, I saw the shape materialize on the ridge exactly where some unconscious part of me had known it would appear, massive and still against the star-dense sky, watching with what I chose to interpret as acknowledgement, if not quite approval. And in that moment of recognition, across the distance that separated our species and our worlds, I felt something settle in my chest that had been displaced since our first encounter. The White Guardian remained visible for perhaps 3 minutes before turning and disappearing into the landscape that had birthed and concealed it across centuries of human expansion into every supposedly empty space the planet offered. And I understood that those minutes represented the answer to my pilgrimage, that presence itself was the communication, that I'd been acknowledged by something that had no obligation to notice my existence, but had chosen to confirm what I'd traveled so far to verify, walking back down through the darkness without headlamp, because somehow the starlight felt sufficient for navigation. I carried a strange peace that had nothing to do with resolution and everything to do with acceptance, with knowing my place in a story much larger than individual biography, with having paid respects to something that deserved reverence regardless of whether my culture's dominant narratives had categories to contain it. The creature would continue its protection with or without human understanding, would remain faithful to its ancient purpose whether anyone acknowledged its existence or dismissed it as folklore. And my responsibility wasn't to prove anything to skeptics, but simply to live in accordance with what I knew to be true, to make decisions informed by the reality that some places remained sacred, not because we designated them as such, but because they were defended by forces we'd be wise to respect, rather than dismiss as primitive superstition or obstacle to development. I never returned to those peaks again, but I glimpse the White Guardian sometimes in peripheral vision when I'm navigating the compromises of ordinary life. A reminder that watches and waits and judges whether humans will ever evolve beyond the appetites that make guardians necessary. And I carry that gaze with me as both burden and compass, asking always whether my choices serve protection or merely convenience, whether I'm honoring what I witnessed or betraying it through comfortable silence. What would you protect if you knew something ancient was watching your choice? Subscribe to hear more stories that change how you see the world.